The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his radio headset. His team of 8 elite Special Forces soldiers had been tracking a high-value target for 3 days through some of the most dangerous territory in the region. Intelligence reports indicated that Commander Khalil, a notorious insurgent leader responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, was hiding in a compound just 2 kilometers ahead. Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of responsibility on his shoulders. At 32, he had led more missions than he could count, but something felt different about this one. The intelligence seemed too clean, too perfect. His instincts, honed by 12 years of combat experience, whispered warnings that he tried to push aside. The mission parameters were clear, and his team was ready. The 8-man unit moved with practiced silence through the narrow mountain pass. Each soldier carried specialized equipment worth more than most people earned in a year. Their training represented decades of combined military expertise, from demolitions to communications, from medical support to precision marksmanship. They were the best America had to offer, hand-picked from thousands of candidates who had dreamed of wearing the green beret. As they approached the target compound, Rodriguez noticed the unusual quiet. No dogs barking, no children playing, no normal sounds of rural Afghan life. The village seemed abandoned, yet their thermal imaging had detected multiple heat signatures inside the target building just hours earlier. Something was wrong, but they were too close to abort without solid intelligence to justify the decision. The team took their positions around the compound. Rodriguez checked his watch and gave the silent hand signals that would initiate the assault. In 60 seconds, they would breach the main entrance while his sniper team provided overwatch from the elevated positions they had secured during their approach. Everything was proceeding according to plan, yet the silence felt like a living thing pressing against his chest. Then Rodriguez saw the first muzzle flash from a position that should have been empty. The crack of the rifle shot echoed off the mountain walls, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. His training took over as he dove for cover, shouting warnings into his radio microphone. But the radio crackled with static, then went completely dead. They had walked into a perfectly orchestrated trap. The compound erupted with enemy fire from multiple directions. Dozens of insurgents emerged from concealed positions that had been invisible during their reconnaissance. The thermal signatures they had detected were decoys, carefully heated objects placed to draw them into the killing zone. Rodriguez realized with growing horror that his team was completely surrounded, cut off from all communication with their base, and facing odds of at least 6-1. Within the first 30 seconds of the ambush, 2 of his men were down. The medic, Sergeant Patterson, was hit while trying to reach the first casualty. The radio operator took a sniper's bullet to the shoulder, but continued trying to establish contact with headquarters. The remaining team members found whatever cover they could and returned fire, but their ammunition wouldn't last long against such overwhelming numbers. Rodriguez made a desperate tactical decision. He ordered his men to consolidate their position in a small building that offered better protection. The movement would be dangerous, requiring them to cross open ground under heavy fire, but staying scattered would guarantee their destruction. One by one, his soldiers made the terrifying dash to the building, dragging their wounded comrades with them. As the last man reached safety, Rodriguez did a quick assessment of their situation. They had maybe 2 hours of ammunition if they conserved carefully. 3 men were wounded, though none critically yet. Their communications were completely jammed, and they were at least 8 hours away from any possible rescue force. The enemy seemed content to keep them pinned down, probably waiting for reinforcements or heavier weapons to finish them off. The silence between gunfire exchanges became more ominous than the shooting itself. Rodriguez could hear his men's labored breathing, the quiet groans of the wounded, and his own heart hammering against his ribs. These were elite soldiers, trained to handle impossible situations, but even they had limits. He had led them into this trap, and now he needed to find a way to get them out alive. Hours dragged by as the insurgents maintained their deadly perimeter around the trapped Special Forces team. Rodriguez watched through a crack in the wall as enemy fighters moved with disturbing coordination, clearly led by someone with military training. The ambush had been planned with precision that spoke of inside knowledge about American tactics and timing. Sergeant Patterson, the team medic, had been working on the wounded despite his own injuries. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, but he refused pain medication to stay alert. His steady hands had stabilized the two critically wounded soldiers, but without evacuation to a proper medical facility, their condition would deteriorate rapidly. The youngest member of the team, Private Collins, had taken shrapnel to his leg and was losing blood faster than Patterson could control. Rodriguez knew they needed a miracle, but miracles rarely came to those who waited for them. He was considering their options when Corporal Williams, their communications specialist, managed to get a brief signal through the jamming. The message was fragmented, but headquarters had received their distress call. The problem was location. The narrow valley and surrounding peaks made helicopter extraction impossible, and the nearest ground forces were at least 6 hours away. The insurgents seemed to understand their tactical situation perfectly. They had positioned heavy machine guns at both ends of the valley, making any attempt to break out a suicide mission. Rocket-propelled grenades were fired periodically at their building, more to terrorize than to cause immediate damage. The psychological warfare was working. Rodriguez could see the strain on his men's faces as hope began to fade. By afternoon, their ammunition was running critically low. The wounded were getting worse, and the heat inside their makeshift fortress was becoming unbearable. Rodriguez made the hardest decision of his military career. He would attempt to break through the enemy lines alone, drawing their fire away from his team, while trying to reach the extraction point that headquarters had designated 3 kilometers down the valley. His men protested immediately. Sergeant Martinez, the team's senior weapons specialist, argued that Rodriguez should stay with the wounded while he made the run. Others volunteered to go in his place, each presenting logical reasons why they were the better choice. But Rodriguez knew that as team leader, this responsibility fell to him alone. More importantly, he was the fastest runner and had the best knowledge of the terrain. As he prepared for what everyone understood might be a one-way mission, Rodriguez thought about his wife Sarah and their 2 young children back in North Carolina. He had promised Sarah before this deployment that he would be more careful, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. Breaking through 30 insurgents armed with automatic weapons certainly qualified as an unnecessary risk, but leaving his team to die was not an option his conscience could accept. The plan was simple and probably suicidal. Rodriguez would wait until dusk, then make his run during the brief twilight period when visibility would be limited. He would carry only his sidearm, extra magazines, and the team's emergency beacon. If he could reach the extraction point and activate the beacon, helicopter support might be able to suppress the enemy positions long enough to get his team out. At exactly 1800 hours, Rodriguez squeezed each of his men's shoulders and moved to the rear exit of their building. The insurgents had focused most of their attention on the front and sides, leaving the back relatively unguarded. It was still a death trap, but it offered the only possible chance of success. He took 3 deep breaths, whispered a prayer he hadn't said since childhood, and sprinted into the gathering darkness. The first 50 meters passed in silence. Then, the night exploded with muzzle flashes and shouting voices. Bullets cracked past his head as he zigzagged between rocks and bushes, using every piece of natural cover available. Rodriguez had covered almost 200 meters when the heavy machine gun found his range. The bullets tore up the ground around his feet, forcing him to dive behind a boulder that was barely large enough to provide cover. He was pinned down, still over 2 kilometers from the extraction point, with dozens of enemy fighters converging on his position. That was when he heard the sound that would haunt his dreams forever. The distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round, followed by the earth-shaking explosion that collapsed part of the building where his team was trapped. Through the smoke and debris, he could hear screaming. The mortar explosion that destroyed part of the building sent Rodriguez into a rage that bordered on madness. The screams of his men echoed across the valley, mixing with the triumphant shouts of the insurgents who believed they had achieved their goal. But Rodriguez was no longer thinking about reaching the extraction point. Every fiber of his being focused on one objective: getting back to his team before they were overrun. What happened next defied everything Rodriguez had been taught about tactical warfare. Instead of continuing his escape, he turned back toward the compound. But he didn't return as the same man who had left. Something fundamental had changed in those moments when he heard his brothers screaming. The careful, methodical Special Forces sergeant had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Rodriguez began hunting the insurgents with a cold precision that surprised even him. He moved through the darkness like a predator, using skills that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his training. His first target was the heavy machine gun crew that had pinned him down. He approached their position from behind, moving so silently that the three-man crew never knew death was coming until it arrived. Using their own weapon, Rodriguez began systematically destroying the insurgent positions that surrounded his team's building. He had become a one-man army, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, striking from unexpected angles with devastating effect. The insurgents, who had been so confident in their overwhelming numbers, began to experience something they rarely felt: fear. The tactical situation shifted dramatically as Rodriguez eliminated one position after another. The insurgents' coordinated attack began to fall apart as they tried to locate and stop the phantom killer who was picking them off. Their commanders shouted orders in multiple languages, but confusion was spreading through their ranks faster than any directive could control it. Rodriguez felt no emotion as he worked. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no fear. He had entered a state that warriors throughout history had described but few had experienced. Every movement was calculated. Every shot was precise. Every decision was made with absolute clarity. He had become the perfect soldier, but at a cost he didn't yet understand. By the time he reached the building where his team was trapped, Rodriguez had eliminated nearly half of the insurgent force. The survivors were scattered and demoralized, no longer functioning as an organized unit. But what he found inside the partially collapsed structure nearly broke the iron control he had maintained throughout his deadly rampage. Sergeant Patterson was dead, killed instantly when the mortar round brought down the wall. Private Collins had died from blood loss, his young face peaceful in the flickering light from a damaged electrical wire. The other wounded soldiers were in critical condition, barely clinging to life. Of his original 8-man team, only 4 were still breathing, and their survival depended on immediate medical evacuation. Rodriguez gathered his surviving men and prepared for the final phase of his plan. The extraction point was still 2 kilometers away, but the route was no longer blocked by organized resistance. The remaining insurgents were scattered and focused on their own survival rather than stopping the Americans. It would still be dangerous, but it was now possible. Carrying the 2 wounded soldiers was going to be nearly impossible across such difficult terrain. Rodriguez made another decision that his training manual would have called suicide. He activated an emergency flare, broadcasting their exact position to any enemy fighters still in the area, but also marking their location for the rescue helicopters that were finally approaching the valley. The sound of helicopter rotors echoing off the mountain walls was the most beautiful thing Rodriguez had ever heard. But the insurgents heard it too, and their scattered forces began converging on the signal flare. The race was on. Would the rescue arrive before the enemy could mount one final assault? Rodriguez positioned himself between his wounded comrades and the approaching insurgents. He had saved enough ammunition for this moment, this final stand that would determine whether his suicidal mission had been worth the cost. The helicopters were close, but not close enough. 3 more minutes, maybe 4, before they could land and extract the survivors. That was when Rodriguez saw him in the distance. The insurgent commander who had planned this ambush, the man whose tactical knowledge had nearly destroyed his entire team. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Rodriguez felt something he hadn't experienced during his rampage: personal hatred for a specific enemy. This man had killed his friends, his brothers. This man deserved to die by his hands alone. The helicopter rotors grew louder as 2 Apache gunships appeared over the ridgeline, followed by a medical evacuation aircraft. But the insurgent commander wasn't finished. He had rallied the survivors of his force for one final assault, determined to inflict maximum casualties before the Americans could escape. Rodriguez counted at least 20 fighters moving toward their position, armed with everything from assault rifles to rocket-propelled grenades. Rodriguez made a calculation that probably saved his remaining team members but doomed him to carry the weight of this moment for the rest of his life. Instead of staying in defensive position with his wounded soldiers, he advanced toward the insurgent line, alone, armed with just his rifle, 2 magazines of ammunition, and a determination forged in the furnace of watching his friends die. What followed was 3 minutes of combat that witnesses would later describe as impossible. Rodriguez moved through the enemy formation like death personified, engaging multiple targets simultaneously, while somehow avoiding the concentrated fire directed at him. He seemed to anticipate every shot, every movement, every tactical decision his opponents made. The first insurgent fell to a perfectly placed shot at 200 meters. The second died while trying to flank Rodriguez's position. By the time the Apache gunships began their attack run, Rodriguez had eliminated 8 more fighters and scattered the rest. But his ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the insurgent commander was still alive, still coordinating his men's attacks from a protected position behind a large boulder. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down just as Rodriguez engaged the last organized group of insurgents. The crew chief and medics immediately began loading the wounded soldiers, working with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they were operating in the kill zone. Every second on the ground increased their chances of being shot down by enemy fire. Rodriguez found himself in a surreal moment of clarity as he watched his surviving team members being carried to safety. The mission had been a disaster by any conventional measure. They had walked into an ambush, lost half their team, and failed to capture their target. But his men were alive. 3 soldiers who had been minutes away from death were now going to see their families again. The insurgent commander made his final mistake when he tried to target the medical helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade. Rodriguez saw the movement and made a decision that violated every rule of engagement he had ever learned. Instead of taking a safe shot from cover, he charged directly toward the insurgent position, firing his last rounds while running across open ground. The commander's rocket missed the helicopter, but exploded close enough to damage the tail rotor. The aircraft began spinning as the pilot fought for control, but Rodriguez's assault had disrupted the insurgents' aim at the critical moment. The helicopter managed to clear the valley walls and head toward the nearest forward operating base, carrying the wounded soldiers to safety. But Rodriguez paid the price for his desperate charge. The insurgent commander's rifle found its mark, sending Rodriguez tumbling behind the same boulder that had provided his enemy's protection. The bullet had passed through his chest, missing his heart by centimeters but puncturing his lung. He could taste blood and feel his strength draining with each labored breath. The insurgent commander approached cautiously, probably expecting to find Rodriguez dead or dying. Instead, he found a wounded American soldier who still had 1 round left in his pistol and enough strength to use it. The 2 men stared at each other for a moment that seemed to last forever. The insurgent was young, probably no more than 25, with intelligent eyes that reflected the same exhaustion Rodriguez felt. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that would change what had happened or what was about to happen. Rodriguez raised his pistol with trembling hands, and the insurgent commander made no attempt to avoid the shot. Perhaps he was as tired as Rodriguez, as sick of the killing and dying that had consumed so many lives in this beautiful, terrible country. The shot echoed off the valley walls, then faded into silence. Rodriguez lay back against the boulder and listened to the sound of the Apache gunship circling overhead. The rescue helicopter's radio calls crackled through the static, confirming that all wounded personnel had been successfully evacuated. His men were safe. The mission, in the only way that truly mattered, had been accomplished. But Rodriguez wasn't ready to die yet. As his vision began to blur and his breathing became more difficult, he heard something that gave him a reason to keep fighting for each breath. The sound of another helicopter approaching, this one flying low and fast. Someone was coming back for him. The helicopter that landed in the valley wasn't a medical evacuation aircraft. It was a small, fast reconnaissance helicopter, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Jennifer Hayes, a woman Rodriguez had trained with years earlier at Fort Campbell. Hayes had volunteered for the dangerous mission of retrieving Rodriguez after hearing the radio transmissions from the wounded soldiers describing what their sergeant had done to save them. Hayes found Rodriguez barely conscious behind the boulder, His uniform soaked with blood but his eyes still alert. She had brought a medic with her, Specialist Thompson, who immediately began working to stabilize Rodriguez for the flight to the nearest trauma center. The bullet had collapsed his lung and caused significant internal bleeding, but it had missed the major arteries that would have meant certain death. As Thompson worked on his wounds, Rodriguez tried to speak but could only manage whispers. Hayes leaned close to hear him over the helicopter's engine noise. Rodriguez wasn't asking about his condition or expressing concern for his own survival. He was asking about his men, demanding confirmation that all 3 survivors had made it safely to medical treatment. Hayes provided the answers he needed to hear. All 3 wounded soldiers were alive and receiving expert medical care at the field hospital. Their injuries were serious but not life-threatening. More importantly, they were all conscious and asking about their sergeant, wanting to know if the man who had saved their lives was going to survive his own wounds. The flight to the trauma center took 18 minutes that felt like hours. Rodriguez drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind replaying the events of the past day in vivid detail. He remembered every face of the insurgents he had killed, every shot he had fired, every decision that had led to this moment. The weight of what he had done was beginning to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. At the trauma center, a team of military surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair the damage caused by the insurgent commander's rifle. The bullet had fragmented inside his chest cavity, requiring delicate surgery to remove all the pieces without causing additional trauma to his organs. Rodriguez's physical condition was complicated by exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological shock of what he had experienced. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead surgeon, had operated on hundreds of combat casualties, but Rodriguez's case was unusual for reasons that went beyond his medical condition. The other soldiers who had been evacuated earlier had provided detailed accounts of what their sergeant had accomplished during the ambush. According to their testimony, Rodriguez had single-handedly eliminated more than 30 enemy fighters, while ensuring the survival of his remaining team members. The military investigation that followed would eventually confirm most of these accounts. Satellite imagery and communications intercepts supported the soldiers' descriptions of Rodriguez's actions. What had seemed impossible was documented fact. One American soldier had defeated a numerically superior force through a combination of tactical skill, physical courage, and something that defied easy explanation. Rodriguez remained unconscious for 3 days after the surgery. When he finally awoke, the first person he saw was Colonel Harrison, his commanding officer, who had flown in from headquarters to personally debrief the surviving members of the team. Harrison had been preparing for a very different conversation than the one he was about to have. Instead of explaining why Rodriguez had violated orders by returning for his team instead of continuing to the extraction point, Harrison found himself listening to a soldier who was consumed with guilt over the men who had died. Rodriguez blamed himself for walking into the ambush, for not recognizing the signs that should have warned him about the trap, for every tactical decision that had contributed to the disaster. Harrison had read the preliminary reports and knew that Rodriguez's self-assessment was completely wrong. The ambush had been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of American special operations procedures. The intelligence that had led the team into the trap had been deliberately fabricated to draw them into the killing zone. No amount of tactical awareness could have prevented what had happened, but Harrison also understood that logic rarely helped soldiers deal with survivors' guilt. Rodriguez had lived through something that killed 4 of his men, and he had done so by becoming something that frightened him. The cold, methodical killer who had stalked through the darkness was not the man Rodriguez recognized as himself. That transformation was going to be harder to heal than his physical wounds. The conversation between Harrison and Rodriguez lasted for 2 hours and covered ground that neither man had expected to explore. Rodriguez described not just what he had done, but what he had felt while doing it. The absence of emotion, the mechanical precision, the way time seemed to slow down during combat. Harrison recognized the symptoms immediately, though he had rarely seen them manifested so extremely in a single engagement. Rodriguez spent 6 weeks recovering at the military hospital in Germany before he was medically cleared to return to the United States. During that time, he received visits from the 3 soldiers whose lives he had saved. Each conversation was difficult in its own way, as these men struggled to express gratitude for actions that had cost other members of their team their lives. The hardest visit came from Sergeant Martinez, who had been one of the critically wounded soldiers Rodriguez had carried to safety. Martinez had lost his left arm below the elbow but was alive, and would eventually return to his family in Texas. He brought news that Rodriguez hadn't expected to hear. The families of the soldiers who had died in the ambush wanted to meet him, to thank him for ensuring their sons and husbands hadn't died alone. Rodriguez initially refused these meetings. He couldn't understand why the families of Patterson, Collins, and the others would want to see the man who had survived when their loved ones hadn't. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, the military psychologist assigned to his case, helped him understand that his survival wasn't a betrayal of the men who had died. It was proof that their sacrifice had meaning. The first family Rodriguez met was Patterson's wife and 2 young daughters. Mrs. Patterson had driven 800 miles to see Rodriguez, bringing letters that her husband had written but never sent. In those letters, Patterson had described Rodriguez as the finest leader he had ever served under, a man who would do anything to bring his soldiers home safely. Reading those words was more painful than any physical injury Rodriguez had sustained. The meeting with Collins's parents was even more difficult. Collins had been 19 years old, the youngest member of the team, and had joined the military to pay for college. His mother asked Rodriguez to tell her exactly what had happened to her son, and Rodriguez found himself describing the ambush in detail for the first time since his debriefing with Colonel Harrison. Mrs. Collins listened to the entire account without interruption, then asked the question that Rodriguez had been dreading. Did her son suffer? Rodriguez could have lied, could have provided comfortable fiction instead of painful truth. Instead, he told her that Collins had been conscious until the end, that he had asked Rodriguez to tell his parents he was sorry he wouldn't be coming home, and that he had died thinking about them. The medal ceremony took place at Fort Campbell on a cold October morning. Rodriguez was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, in recognition of his actions during the ambush. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers, military officials, and family members of the men who had served with Rodriguez. Rodriguez had requested that the ceremony be private, but the military had other plans. His story had become public knowledge, and the media attention had transformed him into something he never wanted to be: a hero. The man who had single-handedly defeated 30 insurgents to save his team was now expected to represent American military virtue to a country that was growing tired of foreign wars. During the ceremony, Rodriguez stood at attention while the citation was read, describing his actions in language that made them sound noble and heroic. But Rodriguez heard something different in those words. He heard the sounds of men dying, the crack of rifle fire in the darkness, the weight of decisions that had determined who would live and who would die. After the ceremony, Rodriguez was approached by a man he didn't recognize, someone who had been watching from the back of the audience. The man introduced himself as James Patterson, the father of the medic who had died in the ambush. Patterson was a Vietnam veteran who understood things about combat that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't experienced them. The conversation between Rodriguez and the older Patterson lasted for hours and covered territory that neither man had expected to explore. Patterson had carried his own burden of survival guilt for 40 years, and he recognized the signs in Rodriguez immediately. The advice he offered was simple but profound. Guilt was the price of caring about the men you served with, but it shouldn't become a prison that prevented you from living. Rodriguez returned to active duty 6 months later, but he was assigned to training positions rather than combat units. The military had decided that his experience was too valuable to risk in another overseas deployment. He spent 3 years training Special Forces candidates, passing on tactical knowledge that had been paid for with blood and brotherhood. Eventually, Rodriguez retired from the military and moved to a small town in Montana, where he worked as a wilderness guide and survival instructor. He married a local teacher, started a family, and tried to build a life that had meaning beyond what had happened in that Afghan valley. But he never forgot the men who had died there, and he never stopped carrying the weight of what he had done to ensure others survived. The story of Rodriguez's actions spread through military circles and eventually became legend. Young soldiers heard about the sergeant who had fought 30 insurgents to save his team and wondered if they would have the courage to do the same. But Rodriguez knew something they didn't understand yet. Courage wasn't the absence of fear or the presence of heroism. It was simply the willingness to pay whatever price was necessary to bring your brothers home.